Okay, so this is Gatsby Part 2 that will take place or begin on page 11 of the text. Coming to you live from the car. Look at this dedication. Okay, so I want you to find the place on page 11, both in the text and the packet, right where Jordan Baker says, "You live in West Egg." Okay, remember Jordan Baker is Daisy's friend. Nick has just gone over to Tom and Daisy's house on East Egg for dinner, and they are about to move to the outside to have their little dinner, and we just heard how Nick thinks that Jordan Baker is pretty attractive looking, okay? And so he's looking at Jordan and everything, and then Jordan says to Nick, okay, again, find your spot. I'll give you a second. Should either be on page 11 of both the text or the packet if you have the packet, okay? So find the spot towards the top of the page on 11 in the text, or towards the bottom of the page if you have the packet, where Jordan says, "You live in West Egg," she remarked contemptuously. "I know somebody there. I don't know a single. You must know Gatsby." "Gatsby?" demanded Daisy. "What Gatsby?" Before I could reply that he was my neighbor, dinner was announced. Wedging his tense arm imperatively under mine, Tom Buchanan compelled me from the room as though he were moving a checker to another square. Slenderly, languidly, their hands set lightly on their hips, the two young women preceded us out onto a rosy-colored porch open toward the sunset, where 4 candles flickered on the table in the diminished wind. Before you go any further, remember I told you should be annotating for motifs? At least paying attention to them. One of the motifs is colors, so you should have annotated rosy-colored. And also, you've got a whole bunch of weather and light here. You got sunset and candles, okay? Just keep that in mind. So Daisy says now, "Why candles?" objected Daisy, frowning. She snapped them out with her fingers. "In 2 weeks, it'll be the longest day in the year." She looked at us all radiantly. "Do you always watch for the longest day of the year and then miss it?" "I always watch for the longest day in the year and then miss it." "Oh, we ought to plan something," yawned Miss Baker, sitting down at the table as if she were getting into bed. "All right," said Daisy. "What do we plan?" She turned to me helplessly. "What do people plan?" Before I could answer, her eyes fastened with an odd expression on her little finger. "Look," she complained. "I heard it." We all looked. The knuckle was black and blue. "You did it, Tom," she said accusingly. "I know you didn't mean to, but you did do it." "That's what I get for marrying a brute of a man, a great, big, hulking physical specimen of a—" "I hate that word, hulking," objected Tom crossly, even and kidding. "Hulking," insisted Daisy. Sometimes she and Miss Baker talked at once, unobtrusively and with a bantering inconsequence that was never quite chatter. That was as cool as their white dresses and their impersonal eyes in the absence of all desire. They were here, and they accepted Tom and me, making only a polite, pleasant effort to entertain or to be entertained. They knew that presently dinner would be over and casually put away. It was sharply different from the West, where an evening was hurried from phase to phase towards its close in a continually disappointed anticipation, or else in sheer nervous dread of the moment itself. "Now you make me feel uncivilized, Daisy," I confessed on my second glass of corky but rather impressive claret. By the way, claret, you guys, is a wine, right? And basically Nick is saying that since he's from the Midwest, he kind of feels a little out of place, like he doesn't know about worldly things. That's why he says uncivilized. So now he says, "Can't you talk about crops or something?" I meant nothing in particular by this remark, but it was taken up in an unexpected way. "Well, civilization's gone to pieces," broke out Tom violently. "I've gotten to be a terrible pessimist about things. Have you read The Rise of the Colored Empires by this man Goddard?" Why, no," I answered, rather surprised by his tone. "Well, it's a fine book, and everybody ought to read it. The idea is that if we don't look out, the white race will be utterly submerged. It's all scientific stuff. It's been proved." Tom's getting very profound. said Daisy with an expression of unthoughtful sadness. He reads deep books with long words in them. What was the word Well, these books are all scientific, insisted Tom, glancing at her impatiently. This fellow has worked out the whole thing. It's up to us, who are the dominant race, to watch out, or these other races will have control of things. We've got to beat them down, whispered Daisy, winking ferociously toward the fervent sun. Well, you ought to live in California, began Miss Baker, but Tom interrupted her by shifting heavily in his chair. Tom shifts in his chair. This idea is that we're Nordics. I am, and you are, and after an infinitesimal hesitation, he included Daisy with a slight nod, and she winked at me again. And we've produced all the things that go to make civilization. Oh, science and art and all that, do you see? There was something pathetic in his concentration, as if his complacency, more acute than of old, was not enough to him anymore. When almost immediately the telephone rang inside, and the butler left the porch, and Daisy seized upon the momentary interruption and leaned toward me. I'll tell you a family secret, she whispered enthusiastically. It's about the butler's nose. Do you want to hear about the butler's nose? That's why I came over tonight. Well, he wasn't always a butler. He used to be the silver polisher for some people in New York that had a silver service for 200 people. He had to polish it from morning till night, until finally it began to affect his nose. Things went from bad to worse, suggested Miss Baker. Yes, things went from bad to worse until finally he had to give up his position. For a moment, the last sunshine fell with romantic affection on her glowing face. Her voice compelled me forward breathlessly as I listened. Then the glow faded, each light deserting her with lingering regret, like children leaving a pleasant street of dusk. The butler came back. Now pay attention here, because this is important, you guys. The butler came back, murmured something close to Tom's ear, whereupon Tom frowned, pushed back his chair, and without a word went inside, as if his absence quickened something within Daisy. She leaned forward again, her voice glowing and singing. I love to see you at my table, Nick. You remind me of a rose, of an absolute rose, doesn't he? She turned to Miss Baker for confirmation. An absolute rose? This was untrue. I am not even faintly like a rose. She was only extemporizing, but a stirring warmth flowed from her, as if her heart was trying to come out to you, concealed in one of those breathless, thrilling words. Then suddenly she threw her napkin on the table, excused herself, and went into the house. Now, before we go on any further, recap of events here. Number one, what do you know about Tom? If you went backwards, you would see that Tom thinks we're all Nordics here, and if we don't look out, the whole race will be utterly submerged. The whole white race, okay? So make the inference. What do you know about Tom? You guys should all be saying, oh yeah, he's a freaking racist, right? Okay, so Tom, they're out having dinner, the phone rings, the butler comes back, whispers something in Tom's ear, where Tom gets up and goes into the house. Daisy says this stuff about Nick looking like a rose, okay, which is like, what is she talking about? And then she gets up and goes into the house, okay? Just keep an eye out. So now, we're at the paragraph where it says, Miss Baker and I exchanged a short glance. Did y'all find it? Okay. Miss Baker and I exchanged short glance, consciously devoid of meaning. I was about to speak when she sat up alertly and said, shh, in a warning voice. A subdued, impassioned murmur was audible or hearable in the room beyond, and Miss Baker leaned forward, unashamed, trying to hear. The murmur trembled on the verge of coherence, sank down, mounted excitedly, and then ceased altogether. This Mr. Gatsby you spoke of is my neighbor. I said, shh, don't talk. I want to hear what happens. Is something happening? I inquired innocently. You mean to say you don't know? Said Miss Baker, honestly surprised. I thought everybody knew. I don't. Why? She said hesitantly. Tom's got some woman in New York. Got some woman? I repeated blankly. Miss Baker nodded. She might have the decency not to telephone him at dinner time, don't you think? Almost before I had grasped her meaning, there was the flutter of the dress and the crunch of leather boots, and Tom and Daisy were back at the table. "Oh, it couldn't be helped," cried Daisy with tense gaiety. She sat down, glanced searchingly at Miss Baker, then at me, and continued. "I looked outdoors for a minute, and it's very romantic outdoors. There's a bird on the lawn that I think must be a nightingale come over on the Cunard or White Star Line," which you guys were cruise ships, the White Star Line, kind of like, think like Titanic, okay? "He's singing away," her voice sang. "It's romantic, isn't it, Tom?" "Oh, yes, very romantic," he said, and then miserably to me, "If it's light enough after dinner, I want to take you down to the stables." The telephone rang inside, startlingly, and as Daisy shook her head decisively at Tom, kind of like, "Don't even think about answering that phone," the subject of stables, in fact all subjects, vanished into air. Among the broken fragments of the last 5 minutes at table, I remember the candles being lit again, pointlessly, and I was conscious of wanting to look squarely at everyone, and yet to avoid all eyes. So he's kind of like, well, this is really awkward. I couldn't guess what Daisy and Tom were thinking, but I doubt if even Miss Baker, who seemed to have mastered a certain hearty skepticism, was able utterly to put this fifth guest's shrill metallic urgency out of mind. The fifth guest was whoever called on the phone, okay? Now, to a certain temperament would be like an attitude, okay? The situation might have seemed intriguing. Ooh, gossip. My own instinct was to telephone immediately for the police. The horses, needless to say, were not mentioned again. Tom and Miss Baker, with several feet of twilight between them, strolled back into the library as if to a vigil beside a perfectly tangible body, while trying to look pleasantly interested and a little deaf. I followed Daisy around a chain of connecting verandas to the porch in front. Verandas, you guys, again, porches. In its deep gloom, we sat down side by side on a wicker settee, which is a bench. Daisy took her face in her hands. As if feeling its lovely shape, her eyes moved gradually out into the velvet dusk. I saw that turbulent emotions possessed her, so I asked her what I thought would be some sedative questions about her little girl, right? Kind of like he's trying to change the subject. She said, "We don't know each other very well, Nick," she said suddenly, "even if we are cousins. You didn't come to my wedding." "Well, I wasn't back from the war." "Oh, that's true," she hesitated. "Well, I've had a very bad time, Nick, and I'm pretty cynical about everything." Evidently, she had reason to be. But I waited. She didn't say any more, and after a moment I returned rather feebly to the subject of her daughter. "I suppose she talks and eats and everything?" "Oh, yes." She looked at me absently. "Listen, Nick, let me tell you what I said when she was born. Would you like to hear?" "Very much. It'll show you how I've gotten to feel about things." "Well, she was less than an hour old, and Tom was God knows where. I woke up out of the ether," and by the way, ether back then was like an anesthesia, okay, "with an utterly abandoned feeling, and asked the nurse right away if it was a boy or a girl. She told me it was a girl, and so I turned my head away and wept. 'All right,' I said, 'I'm glad it's a girl, and I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a beautiful little fool.'" I want you guys to underline that and put a star by it because we're going to go back to that. What do you think? Why in the heck would any mother want their girl, their child, their little baby girl, to grow up to be a fool? Think about that. Now we're going to go back to the paragraph here. And Daisy says, "You see, I think everything's terrible anyhow." Okay, so find your spot. Oh, that's much better. My face isn't as big. She says, "You see, I think everything's terrible anyhow," she went on in a convinced way. "Everybody thinks so. The most advanced people. And I know. I've been everywhere, seen everything, and done everything." Her eyes flashed around her in a defiant way, rather like Tom's, and she laughed with thrilling scorn. "Sophisticated! Ha! God, I'm sophisticated." The instant her voice broke off, ceasing to compel my attention, my belief, I felt the basic insincerity of what she had said. Insincerity. That means, like, you're not truthful. Lying. It made me uneasy, as though the whole evening had been a trick of some sort to exact a contributory emotion from me. I waited, and sure enough, in a moment she looked at me with an absolute smirk on her lovely face, as if she had asserted her membership in a rather distinguished secret society to which she and Tom belonged. So that was outside. Now you see there's a space in the page, so the author is telling us that we're shifting setting now. So now we're going to start on where it says the paragraph that says inside. Inside, the crimson room bloomed with light. There's that light again. Tom and Miss Baker sat at either end of the long couch, and she read aloud to him from the Saturday Evening Post, which was a newspaper. The words, murmurous and uninflected, running together in a soothing tune. The lamplight, bright on his boots and dull on the autumn leaf yellow of her hair, glinted along the paper as she turned a page with a flutter of slender muscles in her arms. When we came in, she held us silent for a moment with a lifted hand. And then she says, "To be continued," she said, tossing the magazine on the table, "in our very next issue." Her body asserted itself with a restless movement of her knee, and she stood up. 10 o'clock, she remarked, apparently finding the time on the ceiling. Time for this good girl to go to bed. Jordan's going to play in the tournament tomorrow, explained Daisy, over at Westchester. Oh, you're Jordan Baker. I knew now why her face was familiar. Its pleasing, contemptuous expression had looked out at me from many rotogravure pictures of the sporting life at Asheville and Hot Springs and Palm Beach. I heard some story of her, too. A critical, unpleasant story, but what it was I had forgotten long ago. Okay, so Jordan Baker is an athlete, a famous athlete. See if you can figure out what kind of sport it is she plays. Hot Springs, Palm Beach, Asheville. They're all really famous places where there are, anybody know? Golf courses. Good night, she said softly. Wake me at 8, won't you? Ha, if you'll get up. I will. Good night, Mr. Carraway. See you anon. Of course you will, confirmed Daisy. In fact, I think I'll arrange a marriage. Come over often, Nick, and I'll sort of fling you together. You know, lock you up accidentally in linen closets and push you out to sea in a boat. All that sort of thing. Good night, said Miss Baker from the stairs. I haven't heard a word. She's a nice girl, said Tom after a moment. They oughtn't to let her run around the country this way. Who oughtn't to? Inquired Daisy coldly. Her family. Her family is one aunt about 1,000 years old. Besides, Nick's going to look after her, aren't you, Nick? She's going to spend lots of weekends out here this summer. I think the home influence will be very good for her. Daisy and Tom looked at each other for a moment in silence. Is she from New York? I asked quickly. From Louisville. Our white girlhood was passed together there. Our beautiful white... Did you give Lick a little heart-to-heart out on the veranda? Demanded Tom suddenly. Did I? She looked at me. I can't seem to remember, but I think we talked about the Nordic race. Yes, I'm sure we did. It sort of crept up on us, and first thing you know... Don't believe everything you hear, Nick, he advised me. I said lightly that I had heard nothing at all, and a few minutes later I got up to go home. They came to the door with me and stood side by side in a cheerful square of light. As I started my motor, Daisy peremptorily, that's one of our vocab words too, remember? Daisy peremptorily called, Wait! I forgot to ask you something, and it's important. We heard you were engaged to a girl out west. That's right, corroborated Tom kindly. We heard that you were engaged. It's a libel. A libel, guys, is a spoken lie. Or no, a written lie. Sorry, libel is written lies. Slander is spoken lies. It's a libel. I'm too poor. But we heard it, insisted Daisy, surprising me by opening up again in a flower-like way. We heard it from 3 people, so it must be true. Of course, I knew what they were referring to, but I wasn't even vaguely engaged. The fact that gossip had published the banns was one of the reasons I had come east. They're talking about something that's written in a paper. You can't stop going with an old friend on account of rumors, and on the other hand, I had no intention of being rumored into marriage. Their interest rather touched me and made them less remotely rich. Nevertheless, I was confused and a little disgusted as I drove away. It seemed to me that the thing for Daisy to do was to rush out of the house, child in arms. Why would Nick say that? I underlined that part because I was like, that kind of seems like a really bold statement for Nick to make. Nick must have some sort of thought in his head that there's something going on where Daisy needed to run away and take the kid with her. But apparently there were no such intentions in her head. As for Tom, the fact that he had some woman in New York was really less surprising than that he had been depressed by a book. Something was Something was making him nibble at the edge of stale ideas, as if his sturdy physical egotism no longer nourished his peremptory heart. Already it was deep summer on roadhouse roofs and in front of wayside garages where new red gas pumps sat out in pools of light. And when I reached my estate at West Egg, I ran the car under its shed and sat for a while on an old abandoned grass roller in the yard. The wind had blown off, leaving a loud, bright night with wings beating in the trees and a persistent organ sound as the full bellows of the earth blew the frogs full of life. He's describing a summer night. The silhouette of a moving cat wavered across the moonlight, and turning my head to watch it, I saw that I was not alone. 50 feet away, a figure had emerged from the shadow of my neighbor's mansion and was standing with his hands in his pockets, regarding the silver pepper of the stars. So there's a guy with his hands in his pockets, looking up at the sky. Something in his leisurely movements and the secure position of his feet upon the lawn suggested that it was Mr. Gatsby himself, come out to determine what share was his of our local heavens. I decided to call to him like, "Hey, Gatsby!" Miss Baker had mentioned him at dinner, and that would do for an introduction. But I didn't call to him, for he gave the sudden intimation, he gave the sudden intimation that he was content to be alone. He stretched his arms outward, toward the dark water in a curious way, and as far as I was from him, I could have sworn he was trembling. So if I can do this, balancing the computer on my legs in the car. He was holding his hands, out like this, reaching towards the water, and his hands are shaking, okay? Involuntarily, I glanced seaward across the bay and distinguished nothing except a single green light, minute or very tiny and far away, that might have been at the end of a dock. When I looked once more for Gatsby, he had vanished, and I was alone again in the unquiet darkness. Dun, dun, dun! Right? Super mysterious kind of ending to chapter 1. That's the end for today, my friends, and I will see you tomorrow.